Jack asked me to do this. I first met Michael, I'm thinking maybe it was around 2003. I met his partner around 2000 when she would come to Omaha to visit. And since then, been out to visit them in Boulder a number of times. And then also they've come here for various presentations and workshops. And I'm trying to remember, I don't remember the dates, but I know one particular thing that applies to all of us in this group is that they came out and did a transition training. I think that was 2009 for transition towns. And we then developed a transition Omaha group from that. And at least Jack and I were in that, and I can't think of what other members might be. But that group we used to meet every month on a Sunday afternoon. And off of that experience together, we developed, it's called the Getting to Know Your Local and Regional Food Shed with our members. And and then I think Let's Eat more from that. We have groups that were interested in, public power and all kinds of things. So they we dispersed and we're doing different parts of transition work. Michael's written 3 books, The Local Food Revolution, How Humanity Will Feed Itself in Uncertain Times, and Reclaiming the Future, How to Lead the Local Food Revolution in Your Community. And he also has a recently published new book, which is online only, and that's called Facing Extinction, How to Navigate the Greatest Challenge in Human History. And he and Lynette Marie, his partner, have also been out doing presentations. I know that probably the most recent was at UNO a few years ago. And I know that at least 2 of our members of the group came from that meeting. And I'm blocking on their names, sorry. Jack, you know who they are, right?
Eric Williams, Eric and Scott, I think were.
Okay, well, Eric was there. I'm also thinking of 2 of our current Let's Eat members.
Oh, Ellen Volko.
Okay, no, it's a couple. And they're on every week, and I'm really sorry, I can't remember.
Pam and Jack.
Yeah, thank you.
Pam and, not Jack, Pam and.
It's Pam and Dan.
Dan
Daly, yeah. Thank you.
You're right, I just got on here, but I knew who you were talking about.
Yeah. And
just in time.
And then he went down to they went down to Lincoln, I believe, and presented about the probably the Local Food Revolution book in Lincoln at a church there. It was a really big turnout. And Slow Money, another project that they've been involved in and come to present about. And Michael, I don't know if you can remember more, but there's a lot of areas and a lot of trips. And we're grateful.
A lot of trips, yeah.
So
well, thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Jack, for the invitation to be here. Thank you all for being here today. This is going to be a little bit different. It's been. I used to do a lot of speaking, just like Kathy was talking about, but since COVID, everything has been online. So it's been. Our work has gone far beyond just our locally focused work. So this gives me an opportunity to kind of do an update on where our work has evolved to in recent years, especially since we were in Nebraska last time. Things have changed a lot. But just to go back a little bit, because of our early work in Colorado and across the country with the transition towns movement, we actually helped to bring the transition movement to North America. So we were really pioneers in all of that, and we're one of the early adopters of slow money as well here in Boulder. And based upon all the early work we did, I mean, we started here in Boulder in 2005, which now seems like a very long time ago. But based upon the 13 years or so of work that we did, and the first couple of books that I wrote, we launched an online course, which we called the Local Food Academy. And that sort of began a process for us of leaving behind our more public work in building local food systems to return to our first love, which is providing what we think of as deep support to individuals who are sort of mysteriously but undeniably called to a level of contribution and service that's of potential evolutionary significance. In other words, people who seem to have some possible role in ushering in a very different kind of future. And recently, to our surprise, we've been functioning as something of a monastery, believe it or not, both secular and virtual, which we've begun calling the Monastery Academy for Conscious Evolution and Co-Creation. And this has grown out of the observation that historically, monasteries of a variety of forms have always emerged during times of civilizational collapse to preserve what's most sacred and precious about being human, and to support those who are wrestling with higher and deeper callings. And I'll come back to this. So we originally began our work in localizing the food supply in Colorado's Front Range, where the vast majority of our state's population lives, because we knew that with climate change becoming runaway global warming, the current industrial food system would soon be devastated. We knew that we'd have to quickly replace it with highly localized regional food systems, or our people could face starvation, and fairly soon. And part of what really tipped us off to this was a man who's the chair of the Atmospheric Sciences Department at the University of Washington, Dr. David Battisti. And he had already demonstrated pretty conclusively that by 2016, that we can anticipate that global food production capacity will be reduced by as much as 30 to 50% by mid-century, primarily because of global warming. And that the breadbasket regions of the world would be hit first and hit the hardest, including the grain-producing Great Plains of North America. So we began our work in all of this in 2005 under the direct guidance of Post-Carbon Institute and the indirect guidance of an organization called Local Futures, which was a much older and more global organization founded by Helena Norberg Hodge. And I got to know the founder of Post-Carbon Institute, Julian Darley, very well. And he considered what we were doing in Boulder to be one of the most promising relocalization projects underway anywhere. And that was really troubling to us because we surely didn't know what we were doing. And we could see that we were not having the kind of impact that was really needed. And in those early days, I also got to know pretty well the senior fellow of Post-Carbon Institute, the author Richard Heinberg. I'm sure many of you have read his work. And I actually got to serve with Richard on the first board of directors of Transition US. And I remember in a private meeting, Somebody's microphone is on. I'm getting quite an echo here. It disappeared. Okay. So in a private meeting with Richard in 2009, he confirmed that the greatest vulnerability in the US was the food supply. And he confided that his research indicated that we could expect the growing food crisis to land here in the US in just a few short years. He said famine was coming to the US unless we could somehow reclaim our food supply locally and take back our sovereignty. And by the way, I just learned this morning that Richard has a new book coming out in September, which he considers the capstone of his entire career. And that book's called Power: Limits and Prospects for Human Survival. So anyway, especially prodded by Richard, we began focusing all our efforts on building a highly localized regional food system in the Colorado Front Range, knowing that less than 1% of our state's food supply was actually produced within Colorado, less than 1%, even though we were an agricultural state. And that 1% local, by the way, was the average across the country. And it still is today. So over 13 years, we mobilized millions of dollars of resources and tens of thousands of hours of local activism and public education into this effort. But I'd have to say that in all that time and with all of that effort, we hardly moved the needle at all. And in the process, we learned just how deeply entrenched the industrial, chemical-based, genetically modified food system really is. And it controls roughly 99% of the food supply in North America. And we also learned how they consider food localization as a threat that they must stop at all costs. And they pretty much have very effectively. For them, 99% control is not enough. They want to have it all. So we saw essentially that the local food movement was failing, even though local food was becoming very popular. But systemically, it was failing. And it was being co-opted and undermined by what I came to call the unholy alliance of big food and big ag and big pharma and big banking and big government, and now big tech, all fueled by big oil. And we learned that the global industrial food system built by this unholy alliance since World War II is now the largest industry in the world. And it's responsible for more than half of all greenhouse gas emissions, more than half. It's the leading cause of the devastation of our biosphere and is the leading cause of human deaths in North America, Europe, and Australia, where more than half of all deaths are from food-related illnesses. That's just incredible. So in the face of this, it kind of doesn't matter how popular local food becomes, just as in terms of global warming, it doesn't much matter how many of us drive Priuses or install solar panels. It's too late for those things to make a significant enough difference. So what we realize now is that we as humanity face a predicament that is unprecedented in human history and unprecedented in the history of life on this planet. First of all, human population, as we now know, is in profound overshoot. which is a direct result of the way that we've come to feed ourselves. The global industrial food system is committed to growing its market in order to keep growing its profits. That's why we're in overshoot. However, the planet simply can't continue to feed or support 7.6 billion people. The maximum sustainable human population on this planet is considered by many scientists to be less than 1 billion, probably more likely in the range of 600 million. And we're clearly heading in that direction before long. But as Jack Alpert at the Stanford Knowledge Integration Laboratory has shown, while arguably the Earth could sustainably support that many people, 600 million, all of those people would be living a miserable subsistence living. Everyone would be farming full-time every day. And as he says, basically with sticks, without the kind of tools that we've come to rely on. So Alpert's recommendation, and I encourage you to look up his work. I think it's very, very prescient. His recommendation is that we intentionally and non-violently, but quickly reduce global human population to a total of just 50 million people, concentrated around 3 bioregions that have the potential for being self-sustaining. And in these 3 bioregions, the remaining human population of 50 million could maintain a modest lifestyle, roughly similar to what the majority of Europeans enjoy today, with a fairly robust but largely non-technological culture. Well, given that we're now at the beginning of a mass extinction event that will eliminate the vast majority of species of life on this planet, probably within the next several decades, it's highly likely that human population will also be drastically reduced to levels of well below 1 billion people before the end of this century, within the lifetimes of our children and grandchildren. You know, as William Catton showed decisively in 1980 in his landmark book, Overshoot, population overshoot is inevitably followed by population crash. So we now know that we're living at the very moment of the beginning of the collapse of human civilization and the near-term collapse of human population and the collapse of the biosphere. And there's not much room for debate about any of this anymore. The Earth's mass extinction event is underway and it's unstoppable. Runaway global warming has already arrived and it's unstoppable. And the collapse of human civilization has already begun, obviously, and it's unstoppable. And the coming crash of human population is now unstoppable too. And it's always been a source of amazement to me that while our farmers, especially those who are doing regenerative kind of farming, even though they don't normally discuss any of this, they seem to know it in the core of their being. It turns out that's why most of them are farming in the first place. Well, what all of this means is that the community of life on this planet is now in existential crisis, meaning that it is in question whether the community of life will be able to continue. We can now understand that relatively near-term human extinction, or at least near-term near extinction, is a very real possibility and could happen in a matter of a few decades from now. And as people like Richard Heinberg and John Michael Greer and many others have taught us to understand, this existential crisis is not a problem that we can solve, but a predicament to which we must now quickly adapt. And those who are still thinking that there must be solutions to all of this just haven't been keeping up with the data. We've gone well beyond the point where solutions are possible. It's a predicament. We simply cannot solve this. And those of us who've been sort of following these matters for years now have had a growing sense of this for some time. We could feel this coming. But in the last few years, since I was last in Omaha, the situation has accelerated quite dramatically. And significantly, one of the things that's different now is that many, many millions of people around the world are waking up to our predicament. And the most dramatic sign that we've seen of this was in the summer of 2018, when a well-respected but little-known UK professor of sustainability, Dr. Jem Bendell, put his academic career on hold to immerse himself in a comprehensive study of everything that scientists knew about global warming at that time. And he tried to publish his resulting paper in academic journals, but was repeatedly rejected. So eventually, Jem self-published, posting a PDF of his very dense 34-page paper online, and he made it freely accessible. It was titled Deep Adaptation, a map for navigating climate tragedy. And to his surprise and to the surprise of all of us, it went viral. Well over 1 million people have since downloaded that document, and tens of thousands of people have self-organized into groups exploring its implications. So this is a global phenomenon. And I'm just not aware of anything like this ever happening before. And Jem Bendell and his perspective have been very influential in the emergence of Extinction Rebellion in the UK, one of the most radical and most ambitious protest movements to emerge in recent years. So if you haven't had a chance to read Deep Adaptation, you've missed perhaps one of the most important documents published in our lifetime. And I would encourage you to read it. Maybe even tonight. We read it often. It's worth reviewing. But this is only one of the reasons that today, perhaps tens of millions of people are concerned that humanity, as well as much of life on this planet, could well become extinct in the relatively near future. Perhaps you've noticed this term existential risk appearing in the media with increasing frequency, existential risk. But that term, we don't quite understand that. It sort of has the feeling about it as the term climate change. It's broadly accurate, but it's not as sharply focused and as direct as what we're now calling global warming. But existential risk was first properly defined by a Swedish philosopher named Nick Bostrom, who says, an existential risk is one that threatens the premature extinction of Earth-originating intelligent life. The premature extinction of Earth-originating intelligent life, or the permanent and drastic destruction of its potential for desirable future development. And so we now live at a time of converging existential risks, creating a planetary existential predicament. And we think that over the coming years of this decade, we'll see existential risk increasingly become the central focus of research and debate and activism and anguish all over the world as humanity awakens to its fundamental predicament and struggles to adjust to this new reality. The possibility of extinction, both a sixth mass extinction of species and the demise of the human species, will be an increasingly prominent matter of concern and debate over the next decade. The 2020s will probably be known as the decade in which humanity either comes to terms with this possibility and responds appropriately, or visibly fails. So I just want to share the essence of the science behind this perspective, the science behind this perspective that's been developing among those who've dedicated their lives to understanding our predicament. So this perspective was offered by Dr. B. Sidney Smith at a conference at Virginia Tech 2 years ago. And here's what Dr. Smith says. The science is now crystal clear. We've got at best 10 years to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, or we'll see at least 4 degrees centigrade of additional warming, possibly as soon as 2040, certainly by 2080, with no means whatsoever to bring the climate back into equilibrium. And by that point, he says, it's now generally believed that feedback loops will kick in, driving temperatures to as much as 10 degrees higher centigrade, no matter what we do. God alone knows if the biosphere will live or die in the aftermath of that event, he says. At a minimum, the ecosystems will collapse. Most species will go extinct. And it's questionable whether humanity will survive in any form much beyond the end of this century. And even if it does, he says, there will be no resource base from which to make a new civilization, possibly for millennia. And he says, we can't change course. Knowing full well the consequences, the human system lurches on helplessly, steadily increasing year by year the release of greenhouse gases into the climate system. If this civilization were to continue, he says, another 20 years, it would mean omnicide. It's fortunate indeed that it cannot continue. Neither technology, nor renewable energy, nor political revolution are going to stay this civilization's collapse. Very strong, very sober, and very thoroughly documented science-based assessment. So the survival of humanity is increasingly questionable and increasingly in doubt. That's just where we are right now. The problem is, as Australian philosopher Toby Ord puts it, humanity lacks the maturity, coordination, and foresight necessary to avoid making mistakes from which we could never recover. And as the gap between our power and our wisdom grows, our future is subject to an ever-increasing level of risk. Well, that's kind of putting the finger on it, I think. The growing gap between our power and our wisdom. And Toby Ord at Oxford University is one of a handful of the most important voices to emerge around the topic of existential risk in recent years. And he recently published a book called The Precipice: Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity, which I think is essential reading for those of us who feel some responsibility for the future. It's one of the best introductions exploring this existential predicament from a moral and ethical perspective. And early on, Toby Ord says, we see a species precariously close to self-destruction, with a future of immense promise hanging in the balance. And which way that balance tips becomes our most urgent public concern. Well, I think it ought to be our most urgent public concern, and I'll come back to it. I'll come back to this. One of the other emerging voices in all of this is Thomas Moynihan at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, who's even more explicit about putting existential risk in a moral context. In his recent book called X Risk: How Humanity Discovered Its Own Extinction, he says, today, we define what we now call existential risks as threats that are of unique moral importance because they endanger the very existence of morality in the world, whether by causing our outright extinction or by irreversibly curtailing our potential to achieve good things. In other words, the awareness of the possibility of extinction brings us to the ultimate moral issue: our ethical responsibility for the continued existence of ethics and responsibility itself. So he's saying that what is at stake is the very existence of ethics and morals and responsibility. And Moynihan, I think this is important, makes the crucial point that not all existential risks are extinction scenarios. Some existential risks could result in what he calls worse than death scenarios, such as he says, the permanent installation of an oppressive totalitarian regime, which through technological dominance and omnipresent surveillance becomes impossible to overthrow. Here, Homo sapiens would survive, he says, but its potential would be cruelly curtailed and its existence defined only by untold suffering. And such an oppressive totalitarian regime could be human, it could be extraterrestrial, or it could emerge from artificial intelligence. And these are the possibilities that are being considered among those who are exploring existential risks. So becoming aware of existential risks and charting appropriate responses and possible paths forward becomes a momentous and extremely urgent responsibility in our time. And who can bear that responsibility? Who could we trust with that? Who's qualified? Who's even willing to face this? And what is our responsibility in this existential crisis? And while the threat of near-term extinction is becoming a prominent theme in human culture and discourse, this is happening for most people primarily at a subterranean or less than conscious level. This is something that almost no one wants to think about, much less talk about. But nevertheless, people are haunted by it daily. So along with all life on this planet, humanity does face a truly existential crisis, which casts profound doubt on even the possibility of a viable future. But the nature of this Anthropocene predicament is widely unacknowledged, it's misunderstood and undiscussed, and therefore remains largely ignored or denied. And I'll come back to this in a few minutes. Part of the difficulty here is that we are a young and immature species, roughly at the stage of early adolescence. And we're being thrust into a situation that requires a level of maturity and wisdom and ethical discernment and other capacities that we simply have not yet developed. And as we survey around the world the increasing division and conflict that we see everywhere today, we can sort of legitimately ask whether there are any adults in the room, or whether we're in a situation like the parable that William Golding wrote just over 60 years ago in Lord of the Flies, where in the complete absence of adults, young boys stranded on an isolated island descended into violent, self-terminating chaos. What adults can we look to now for guidance? Historically, those who have studied the collapse of civilizations over millennia tell us that when civilizations collapse, insanity prevails. Madness, chaos, violence, destruction. All human institutions collapse, including those that might otherwise be hopeful sources of adult guidance, including the educational and religious. Everything and everyone seems to be falling apart. And throughout history, in such times of collapse, mysteriously and spontaneously, inexplicably, monasteries arise. They're not necessarily religious, but they are decidedly spiritual. It's said by some that monasteries are the most resilient and stable form of human organization. While civilizations rise and fall and dark ages come and go, monasteries somehow remain as anchor points for that which persists beyond history. And now, monasteries of astonishing variety are arising around the world, offering respite and concentrated study and guidance and community and pathways of service for those who are attempting to follow a deep and mysterious inner calling. And some of these may not think of themselves as monasteries, but they share the same common purpose. So we see the rapid proliferation of such monasteries now as a harbinger of the advent of a new dark age of unprecedented suffering, the Anthropocene epoch, which will witness not only the collapse of human civilization, but of the entire planetary community of life. The sixth mass extinction, as I've said, it's already underway and accelerating exponentially. And the likelihood of near-term extinction of the human species is now being seriously considered by philosophers and cosmologists and ethicists and activists all over the planet. However, following a deep inner calling after maybe even lifetimes of preparation, certain individuals seem to have been born into this existential crisis because they have something unique and essential to contribute in this situation, something that no one else can possibly give. Somehow they carry within them the seeds of the future of humanity and are called to give birth to the next stage of evolution, what we could call the new humankind. And we at the Monastery Academy have come to call these individuals evolutionary catalysts. And I have concluded that there's no way around the reality that the entire future of humanity and the future of life on this planet depends on a small number of these evolutionary catalysts being able to accept and fulfill this responsibility. And I have no doubt that there are evolutionary catalysts here in this conversation this evening. So we in Colorado were, in the face of all this, compelled to bring our particular monastery into existence, the Monastery Academy for Conscious Evolution and Co-Creation, as a kind of school, roughly analogous to a mystery school, perhaps. But it's for those who are ready to enter into the process of learning together to be conscious agents of evolution and catalysts for the planetary evolutionary course correction that we call the deep revolution. So for this reason, as a school, the monastery has developed a year-long training and support program for these individuals, and we call this the fellowship. And it now includes people in North America, in the UK, in Australia, and New Zealand. And this is not a personal growth and development program, but an activation and mobilization of those who are truly called to this mission. And what all of us in the fellowship have in common is that in response to a shared understanding of urgent need, we seek to significantly increase the impact, effectiveness, and scale of our work and contribution in our specific arenas of calling, whatever they may be. So in the fellowship, we have the opportunity to align our lives and work with this very force of evolution that has been cultivating the deep revolution for millennia and now requires our conscious and active participation. So this evolutionary bottleneck we're at here, the Anthropocene, can be a pivotal moment in our lives and in the evolution of life on this planet. So as some of you may know, the Monastery Academy is now in the process of producing the Beyond Extinction Summit, which is a multi-day global online event to be held in early 2022. This is a massive undertaking, so we started early. And this summit will bring together a wide variety of perspectives, featuring contributions from some of the world's most significant voices and perspectives to explore both humanity's existential risks and evolutionary potential. So represented in this summit will be visionaries and activists and philosophers and ethicists, academic researchers, artists, journalists, astrobiologists, indigenous elders, health practitioners, entrepreneurs, permaculturists, and technology innovators, as well as spiritual and religious leaders. So we anticipate a total of perhaps 70 presenters during the summit. And the way we're designing this will be able to offer a rich tapestry of interviews and presentations and panel discussions and community dialogues, which could help clarify a path forward for humanity. So, sort of at the precipice of catastrophe, the Beyond Extinction Summit calls together many of our greatest minds and hearts to consider the dimensions and meaning of our existential crisis and to explore the most ethical and evolutionarily creative responses available to us, including possible pathways for course correction and ultimate recovery. But the summit is less about survival than it is about attempting to map a course to the next stage of human evolution, species adulthood, and biosphere emergence, all in the context of the long evolutionary arc of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the moral universe. And the intention is to create an environment in the summit in which meaningful dialogue and inquiry can reveal deeper understanding and ignite higher motivations and mobilize appropriate action. And I've in exploring this, I've noticed that there are many authors and thinkers and activists who have something truly important to contribute to this conversation, but there's currently no adequate forum for this, and very little access to those limited forums that do exist. So many of those who have important contributions to make in this predicament and have been quietly at work on these issues for many years are not even yet aware of each other. So part of the intention here is to increase the level of collaboration and co-creation across the community of those who need to be having this conversation together. And I should say that the discussion will not be binary, survival versus extinction, but it'll be nuanced and generative, because ensuring mere survival has already proved an inadequate motivation for the sacrifices that are needed to create a viable future. Our existential crisis demands humanity's wisest and most careful consideration. So we feel that for humanity to rise to the level of response that will be required to ensure that existential risk does not lead inexorably to humanity's self-termination, we will need to first squarely face the realities of possible extinction. The decisions that we make in the next few years and even how we make those decisions will have enormous consequences over timescales that are truly cosmic in proportion. So the Beyond Extinction Summit seeks to increase awareness of the realities of existential risk and to raise the level of consideration so that it includes the moral, the spiritual, and the sacred. You know, as Thomas Moynihan says, we need a public conversation about the long-term future of humanity, the breathtaking scale of what we can achieve, and the risks that threaten all of this, all of us. We feel this is a conversation that needs to be accessible to millions of people. So that's our vision for the Beyond Extinction Summit. And I want to open this up for questions and discussion in just a minute, but there is one other emerging development at the monastery that I want to briefly share with you. It's very new, and the vision is still unfolding. I've indicated that most of our work in recent years has focused on emerging evolutionary catalysts, those individuals who are destined to take their place on the front lines of what we call the deep revolution. But recently, we've been considering another group, those who we could consider perhaps as emerging evolutionary elders, people of a certain age and maturity who are in a position to serve as teachers and guides and counselors and way showers for those who bear responsibility for building the new humankind out of the ashes of this dying civilization and dying biosphere. And most of these emerging evolutionary elders are among the so-called baby boomers born from 1946 to 64, but they could be a bit older or even a bit younger. But these are individuals who are called to be vehicles for the greatest transfer of wisdom and wealth in human history, the greatest transfer of wisdom and wealth in human history. So they're called to help initiate and support those who will become the frontline leaders and evolutionary catalysts of the deep revolution. And some people in this category may also be important sources of capital for those who are catalyzing what we call centers of aliveness, such as regional food sheds, as lifeboats for at least a remnant of humanity through the stormy seas of the Anthropocene epoch. So this new program will simply be called Legacy. And for us, this is a radical expansion of the very idea of legacy. So many people we meet and talk to when they begin to understand the depth of our predicament feel almost a sense of despair because they say, well, what can I do? There's nothing I can do. Well, there is. And this program, Legacy, can open the door to that. So we're just creating this program now, and we'll open it up to a small beta group in July. And if this is something that you'd like to explore with us, I'd encourage you to email me at michael@deeprevolution.net. And our website for the Monastery Academy is deeprevolution.net. And there you can learn all about the Monastery Academy and the fellowship. So I've covered a lot of ground, taken a lot of time here, but I appreciate your patience and would now like to open this up for your questions and your comments.
Michael, thank you for that presentation. The numbers I hear, and it's kind of crazy because I can't even think, or I can't even conceptualize this, that there'll be 2 billion more people in the world in 30 years, within 30 years. It doesn't even seem possible that can happen.
So those kind of numbers are coming from the UN. And I feel like, it's like the UN's IPCC in their study of climate change. Their data is behind the current reality. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And population is really an interesting issue. I've been reading recently about how China is struggling because their population is declining rapidly. So that's happening on one hand, and on the other hand, I read a report saying that Nigeria's population is expanding so rapidly that it's likely to hit what China's population is now by 2050. I mean, that's just unthinkable.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't account for any of the impact of global warming primarily on our food supply. I mean, if our food supply is cut by 30 to 50% over the next 2 or 3 decades, we're going to see a lot of starvation.
And to the point you've been making for a long time, all it takes is a pandemic, and you suddenly see that food processors can't keep up, or packing plants can't keep up, or one ship crashes, or in a canal in a far off land, and suddenly all the supply chains are disrupted to the point where you have inflation, you have shortages.
And we were impressed recently, impressed is the wrong word, JBL, the largest meat producer in the world, had to shut down many of its plants because of a cyber attack just recently. So suddenly the meat supply was threatened, because of, well, we can't say who's behind it, but what it does point to is the vulnerability that we're facing. Not that I'm very excited about industrial meat, but that's a lot of people put out of work.
You know that here in Nebraska, we're surrounded by corn and soybean farmers.
I noticed that when I was there. Yes.
Yeah. And also a lot of feedlots and cattle producers. And, something that has been, I don't know how to explain it for many years now, is I don't understand why they either refuse to believe, like in climate change, or they're just, I don't understand their resistance, or why they can't see it. It just seems there's so much data out there, and there's just always resistance to it, and they find reasons to not believe it, and they get, and do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's a pattern. We saw this same pattern in the tobacco industry. So the tobacco industry spent hundreds of millions of dollars to keep the truth from people, to essentially brainwash people so that they could not see the danger, or could not respond to it. So, the unholy alliance that I speak of is probably the most powerful propaganda machine in the world today. And they do their job very, very well. And so, part of our lesson in working here in Colorado, as we got to know farmers, we began to have a lot of compassion for them, because they feel utterly trapped, and they feel that something is wrong. Many of them feel that the way that they're farming is obviously not good for the planet, but they don't see any way that they can possibly change. So they're in a very, very difficult situation. And so some of the effort that goes on here is trying to build pathways for them to convert to forms of farming that are more sustainable and regenerative. But this is pretty tough. If you have destroyed your soil with the chemicals and plowing for the last 30, 40 years, it takes years for that land to recover. So where does revenue come from during that time? And so that's what we're working on here, is how to provide some sources of revenue so that those farmers can survive. And many farmers now are just, they're giving up. They're getting pretty advanced in years, and there's nobody who wants to come up and take over what they're doing. They're giving up. It's a really sad, tragic situation that's happening for our farmers across the country.
Are you working at the national level now? Because I think subsidies is probably a reason why there's no motivation to change.
Yeah,
Well,
this is locally based here. I just don't have much confidence of myself in I can't say that I was thrilled at Biden's choice for Secretary of Agriculture. We had him once before, and I don't see that he will be on the leading edge of change here. So we're doing what we can on a local level, working on the level of cities and towns and counties working together, and the state as well. Fortunately, we have some pretty progressive thinkers in our state agriculture system.
Well, that's important too. I mean, I think it has to come from both ways. So now the next question that I have is kind of related, but you mentioned when you first started speaking about the resistance of the agriculture community to, or not the resistance, but their threat. They feel threatened by this.
They feel threatened.
By this tiny little group of people who are also trying to provide food, because that's what farming is it's providing food for people. And it's just a different kind of food. And so do you have any more, I don't know. I mean,
well, they see it as competition, and there is fear that people. I mean, so we saw this around the GMO issue. I mean, they were terrified that if people started rebelling against GMOs, that their profits could go down dramatically. So whenever the controversy came up, and it came up very strongly in Boulder County, they organized just to put the hammer down to squash that controversy. And they have the political and financial power to be able to do that. And they did. We did everything we could to stop GMOs in Boulder County on county-owned land, and we could not do it. We were outgunned, outspent. It was a very humbling experience.
mm-hmm. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, because I have a lot of friends even that are farmers.
Yeah.
And I always try and say, well, it's just another way to feed people, I mean, and there's plenty of room for everybody because they're threatened by soy milk. They're threatened, I mean, on all levels of agriculture. They're even by the organic farmers. And, it's.
Several years ago, Kathy, maybe you remember what year was it? 2013 when the flood was here in Boulder.
Yeah, it was 2013. Yeah.
2013. So we had tremendous floods, along the Front Range in Colorado, and the saddest thing I saw during those floods was the conventional farmers, who, I mean, obviously they're farming lots of land, so their farms, their homes are far away from towns, far away from neighbors, and suddenly with the floods they were completely isolated and cut off. And there was no support for them. There was nobody to look out for them. Some of them waited for weeks without electricity. And I thought, wow. Yeah, so they've built a way of life, a way of doing business that cuts them off from what's most important in life.
Yeah,
So
I'm always looking for ways to try and bridge the gap with them, or ways
Yeah.
to, talk with them. But at some point, I mean, sometime I finally, I think after a long time, realized that I guess we just think different. I mean, maybe there just is no way to.
Well, it's an example of the kind of divisiveness that has gripped our society.
Yeah.
So the division and conflict is so deep, and that's all a sign of the collapse of our civilization. That kind of polarization always takes place when a civilization begins to collapse.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's a pattern. That doesn't make it feel any better. I appreciate your questions, Kimberly.
Yeah, you bet.
Any other questions? Alan, you always have questions.
Well, I'm wondering about the timing. I think the general conclusions of, yeah, civilization's in a lot of trouble and population's in overshoot, no doubt about that. And a collapse is going to happen, but I'm not sure how you can time that to 20 years or 200 years.
Well, one of the metrics, so I mentioned Dr. David Battisti at the University of Washington, who grew up in a farming family in upstate New York, by the way. So he has some visceral understanding of this. But his studies show that for just looking at warming alone, not the associated impacts, but just warming alone, for every degree centigrade increase in temperature, there will be a 10% reduction in food production capacity. 1 degree equals 10% reductions. And if you add to that what goes along with the increase in temperature, like increased susceptibility to pests, soil erosion, and so on, a number of factors, you can see that 10% is low. So if we hit 4 degrees centigrade by mid-century, that's a good bit of our food supply that's just wiped out. So you won't read that in the media. You won't read that in even among activists, because they're not getting that kind of data, because that's conversations among climate scientists, which we don't ever get to hear. So there's a lot of data that supports the idea that this is all unfolding much more rapidly than we ever thought before.
So what do you mean by reduction in food supply? Like, I mean, I feel like if I just look at me right here, that I grow some of my own food. I mean, not everything, by a garden. And so, they are developing different, or they work on different seeds that can withstand drought. I mean, I have an ample water supply. I could water them with the drought. I could put shade over them if they need the shade. I could, put a greenhouse up to extend my growing season. So
you can't do that if you're producing commodity crops on hundreds of thousands of acres.
But commodity crops aren't really food.
That you might get some argument about that.
I would get argument, but it's still nothing that you can eat.
No,
You know,
no,
like,
it's,
yeah,
it's,
I'm
it's,
surrounded by corn, but I don't go eat it.
it's not, but it is the basis of our industrial food system. And
Mhm.
it's the industrial food system that will collapse first. So this much more sustainable and localized and regenerative kind of farming and gardening that we're all learning about, that will sustain a small number of us. But we have this terrible problem, and we face this in Colorado, realizing that if all of us who've learned about gardening and permaculture and regenerative farming and all of that are producing to the maximum amount that we cannot possibly feed 5.6 million people in Colorado. We can't do it. There isn't enough land. There aren't enough of us to do that. So something's got to give, and unfortunately, it will not be a peaceful decline. It will be a sudden collapse, probably.
Mhm. Is there any data that suggests or that would say how many people we could sustain from small farms?
Well, I think
So
I
right
think that
now
that's essentially what Jack Alpert's research, and it wasn't just him, it was a whole team of scientists, including David Pimentel, what they were looking at when they figured it all out, added it all up, that if everybody was doing that small level of farming, that the earth could sustain 600 million people, which is
okay.
less than 10% of what we have right now.
Right. So even though even though industrial farming is not, I say it's not food, but the way people are eating when they process it into what they're processing it into is how people are eating. And if we don't have that, then people have to change the way they eat.
Yeah.
And if we go to small local producers, we can't sustain the population. Is
That's
that
right.
kind of what you said?
Yes,
Yeah,
and the population is going to decline anyway because of the multiple impacts of global warming. It's not just food, but food will be the biggest impact. But
And
at
what
the
are the
same
other
time,
ways that the population? Go ahead.
well,
I'm sorry.
heat is one of the most severe. I mean, so we're seeing in the Middle East now. I think this week, trying to remember my details here, maybe it was Syria. They were projecting getting up to 128 degrees. I mean, 128 degrees. I mean, that's just, you cannot survive, in temperatures like that. And so we're seeing radical increases in temperatures in many places throughout the world. So that's one aspect, and when there are food shortages, again, this, we saw this example in Syria several years ago. Food shortages triggered a mass migration, into Europe, which we're still sorting out. We don't know how to deal with this. As sea levels rise, hundreds of millions of people will have to migrate. Where will they go? Which countries will accept them? Which countries will go to war to prevent, that taking in those kinds of people? So there are 1,000 different ways that we could lose our population.
And so then kind of just going back to this, the way, just how we think differently than some large ag people. they would claim that this is just just a cycle. We've gone through, cycles in the earth over, all these years. And so what would you say would show that this isn't just a cycle, but that it is a man-made
Well,
phenomenon and is different this time?
There is no end to that argument. And so
I know.
so
I may be asking a possible question, but
the important
I
thing
don't
is to not get caught in the argument.
Well, Catherine Hayhoe has data that shows that essentially all of the natural forcings that would increase the temperature of the globe are moving in the opposite direction. So more than 100% of the global warming that we're seeing right now is due to burning of fossil fuels.
Yeah. But you cannot win a rational argument in this any more than we could have a rational argument during the most recent election.
I think I feel like you should be able to rationalize this with someone.
Yeah.
And I'm still accepting the fact that, like I said before, I guess you just have to accept the fact that you think differently. And
yeah, you have, so in the end, all we can do is to love them, have compassion for them,
right.
and to not get caught in the trap of a rational argument. They've got more data than we do. Even though I don't consider it correct, they've got a lot more of it than we do.
Yeah.
But again, think about what happened with the tobacco industry and the kind of propaganda that they developed. And many of the same companies who developed that propaganda, the advertising and PR companies, are now working for the Unholy Alliance because they've got the same kind of challenge. Only they have a much larger war chest now than they did with the tobacco industry.
Well, I find it interesting that no matter what the organic and non-GMO people come up with, Big Ag tries to replicate, only they really can't at their scale. So, they're on the organic bandwagon now, so they produce organic food. And then we use the word, they use the word organic and so that gets confusing because they use it not accurately. And then now so now we're onto this regenerative and the soil. And so now they're catching on.
Yeah, so they will co-opt that too. One of the really sad things that we saw is, a few years ago, I realized that since we have such a limited supply of arable land, that we are going to need to go into indoor food production as much as possible. And for some farmers, that looked like a viable alternative. In fact, we spent a lot of time here in Boulder County trying to work out investment deals that could make it possible to build high level of production greenhouses that were all organic, and farmers were really interested in that. Well, so that whole opportunity has now been taken away because the big ag and big food have moved in with big money to fund these huge greenhouses, with plants that will never see soil in their lifetimes. But those companies will make a lot of money, and the farmers have all been pushed out. They will not be involved in that industry. It's sad to see. So yeah, there's a lot that's going to unravel, in the coming years.
Yeah. Well, I guess if there's any positive to it, it'll be that we get to watch it.
Well,
We're
but
living at a time
it's,
that we get to see it happen.
we,
you know?
we will certainly be witnesses, but the positive thing about all of this is you, Kimberly, as you are struggling with these questions, what you will learn in the process and what you will be able to teach others decades down the road will be so important.
Well, the problem is I would like to teach it, or I would like to get the people that I feel need to hear it on board.
Yeah.
And like I said, I live in, even though I'm close to Omaha here, I still live in a bit of a rural area. I mean, I'm surrounded by, the other people. and and
dear.
I know I've learned that you have to just touch it very, very lightly. I mean, if you come off too forceful, you just lose them. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. And maybe it's really not important in the end, but I always just feel like I want to try and get them to do things differently. I mean, even I used to work for the Forest Service, so even windbreaks and riparian areas would help
Sure.
reduce the water consumption and growing something other than corn, which requires a lot of water, but no takers.
So you are one of the evolutionary catalysts that I was talking about. Well, actually, and I know Jack and Kathy are as well. I don't know Alan well enough, but I suspect he is. But that passion, that fire that you carry within you is the most important thing about this movement. It's more important than any results that we might get. Who you are becoming is more important than any other results that we might get.
Well, what do you do with that? What do you do?
You'll find the way, and you'll be teaching us.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've thought about a lot of these things, but not quite on the scale that you have talked about.
Yeah.
So it gives me more to think about.
Yeah. Did we wear them out, Jack?
I don't think so. Michael, it's always a pleasure. Your thought leadership over the years has been an inspiration to me, certainly, and I know a lot of other people in Omaha who you've inspired. So thank you for that.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be able to talk about these things with others who are working on this. We have so much to learn and so much to discover, and it seems like we're out of time, but I think that we have to think in terms of the very long term, and that's part of why we created this program called Legacy. We have to think even beyond our own lifetimes. But how do we do that? That's what we need to learn, because it's clear we're not going to get this job done within our lifetimes. We're just not.
Well, I think that it's a very, very slow process because it is generational,
Yes. Right.
because even like so at the University of Nebraska, I was disappointed to learn this when I was talking to a professor, and some of the big money is even in the university now, and he's a professor in the ag department, and they weren't allowed to do research trials with Monsanto seeds. And
Yeah.
so
they weren't allowed to study it. Yeah.
Right, when you have somebody there that's contributing money or however they got in there, that is saying that you can't, compare trials with this. And that's
Well-
what they're, and then the students are still learning a lot of big ag things, but at the University of Nebraska now, we do have a sustainable ag, somebody that's focused on that. And this was an agroforestry instructor. And so you're getting that, but it's the majority of the students are still learning still big ag things. So I think it's going to
Sure.
be, I don't know when it's going to happen, but eventually there's going to be more and more sustainable ag people as regenerative agriculture and things like that become more common. And so it's not going to be until they're running the farm, because right now dad and grandpa still run the farm for it to tip. So, so it is a process for sure, and going to take a while.
Indeed. Well, thank you all very much. It's great to be with you and to explore these things together. We have huge challenges ahead, but in many places, the right people are beginning to show up, and that's very inspiring.
Thank you,
Thank
Michael.
you very much for a positive, positive talk about the future, even though it's a negative, negative topic. But yeah, I appreciate it. It's been good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, and wish you the very best there, and hope to see you again soon in person.
Bye.
Bye-bye.